Jungkook collapses mid-rehearsal, but it's Jimin's haunting reaction that shatters Taehyung and exposes a secret no one was ready to face. The crack of Jungkook's knees hitting the stage floor echoed through the empty arena like a gunshot. For a fraction of a second, the music kept playing, the bass line of their new title track still pounding through the monitors, the choreography still cycling through its final 8 count. And in that sliver of time, 6 bodies kept moving because muscle memory is faster than fear. Then Jimin, who had been positioned directly behind Jungkook in the V formation, collided with his crumpled form and stumbled sideways, and the spell broke. "Jungkook!" Hosek's voice, sharp and immediate, sliced through the music before the sound engineer could kill the track. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It pressed against the walls of the Seoul Olympic Gymnasium like something physical, something with weight. And in that silence, every small sound became enormous. The scrape of Namjoon's sneakers as he sprinted across the stage, the clatter of a water bottle someone knocked over, the strange wet sound of Jungkook's forehead pressing against the cold black flooring. He was face down, not crouching, not kneeling, not in any position that suggested intention. He had simply folded, the way a building folds when its foundation gives out, and his right arm was bent at an angle beneath his chest that made Taehyung's stomach clench even from 20 feet away. "Don't move him!" That was Seokjin, already on his phone, already dialing, his free hand outstretched as if he could hold the others back through sheer force of authority. His voice carried the calm of someone who had rehearsed emergency scenarios in his head 1,000 times, not because he was paranoid, but because he understood, perhaps better than any of them, that they were 7 men who routinely pushed their bodies past the breaking point under stadium lights and called it art. "Don't move him! Call the medic! Where's Dr. Park? Someone get Dr. Park right now!" Namjoon was already kneeling beside Jungkook, his large hands hovering just above the younger man's back without touching, as if Jungkook's body had become something fragile and sacred and terrifying all at once. "Jungkooka," he said, and his voice, usually so measured, so deliberately composed, cracked on the second syllable. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. Jungkook's body was still, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of absence, that particular quality of motionlessness that makes you realize how much of a person's presence is actually movement, the constant micro-adjustments of breathing and twitching and being alive. Yoongi had stopped 6 feet away. He hadn't moved any closer, and he hadn't moved any farther, and his face had gone completely blank in the way that Taehyung had learned over more than a decade meant that Min Yoongi was feeling something so enormous that his entire system had shut down the display to keep functioning. His right hand was gripping his left wrist, squeezing it, the tendons standing out like cables. That was the only visible sign. But it was Jimin who destroyed Taehyung. Not immediately. In the first 5 or 6 seconds after Jungkook collapsed, Jimin had stumbled back from the collision and caught himself, and Taehyung had assumed, in the rushed, shallow way you make assumptions during a crisis, that Jimin was just processing, just reacting, just doing what they were all doing. But then Taehyung looked at Jimin's face and the assumption disintegrated. Jimin wasn't shocked. Jimin wasn't confused. Jimin wasn't scrambling toward Jungkook the way the others were or frozen in stunned disbelief the way Yoongi was. Jimin was standing exactly where he'd stumbled to, 3 steps stage left of Jungkook's collapsed form, and his expression was one that Taehyung had never seen on Park Jimin's face in all their years together. It took Taehyung a long, terrible moment to identify it, because it didn't belong there, because it was an expression that contradicted everything he thought he knew about Jimin and Jungkook and the bond between them. It was guilt, not the fresh, startled guilt of a surprise, not the, "oh God, what happened" guilt of witnessing an accident. It was old guilt, heavy, settled in, the kind that has had time to build rooms inside your chest and furnish them. Jimin's eyes were fixed on Jungkook's motionless body with the specific devastation of someone who had been watching a countdown reach 0, who had seen this moment approaching from a great distance and had done nothing, or not enough, to stop it. Jimin knew. Taehyung realized. The thought arrived with the force of something physical striking him in the sternum. He knew this was going to happen. And that's when Taehyung's vision blurred. Not from the overhead lights, not from sweat, not from the dust that the stage fans were still circulating through the venue. His eyes filled because of the simple, devastating mathematics of the scene before him. Jungkook on the ground, and Jimin standing above him with the face of a man who had been carrying a secret too heavy for his frame. And the distance between those two things, between Jimin's knowledge and his silence, opening up like a fissure in the floor of everything Taehyung had believed about their friendship. He felt the tears before he understood them. They ran hot down his face, and he didn't wipe them, and he didn't look away from Jimin, and Jimin didn't look at him. Jimin was looking only at Jungkook, and his lips were moving, forming words or prayers or apologies that produced no sound. The medic arrived in under 2 minutes, but those 2 minutes contained entire years. Dr. Park Sung-hee, a compact woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the unflappable calm of someone who had spent 2 decades in emergency medicine before taking a position with the company, pushed through the ring of staff members and knelt beside Jungkook with practiced efficiency. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. She lifted his eyelid with her thumb. She spoke his name 3 times in a clear, clinical voice that was designed to penetrate unconsciousness. On the 3rd call, Jungkook made a sound. It was small and lost, and it wasn't a word, more like the ghost of a groan, the kind of noise you make when your body is trying to come back online but hasn't quite found the switch. His fingers twitched against the stage floor. "He's responsive," Dr. Park said, and 7 people exhaled simultaneously, a collective release of breath that swept through the gymnasium like wind. Namjoon stood up slowly, his knees audibly cracking, and Taehyung saw that his hands were shaking. Not a lot. Just enough that Kim Namjoon, who had led them through controversies and comebacks and concert tours, and the kind of pressure that would have pulverized most people, couldn't hide the tremor in his fingers when it was Jungkook on the ground. "What happened?" Namjoon asked, and the question wasn't directed at anyone specific. It floated into the space above the stage and hung there, unanswered. Because the honest answer, the real answer, was complicated in ways that none of them were ready to articulate in that moment. The honest answer involved months of accumulation, of warning signs stacked on top of warning signs like geological layers, each one individually dismissible, collectively catastrophic. The honest answer involved Jungkook's specific psychology, the youngest, the one who arrived at 14 and learned that love was earned through perfection, that rest was a luxury he hadn't yet deserved, that his body was an instrument belonging to everyone but himself. But those were the deep answers, the tectonic ones. On the surface, what had happened was simple and visible in hindsight. Jungkook had stopped sleeping. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered alarm bells if anyone had been paying the right kind of attention. It had started 3 months ago when the company announced the world tour, their most ambitious yet. 42 cities in 14 countries over 8 months, with a new album to promote and a documentary crew following their every move. Jungkook received the tour schedule the same day he'd gotten the results of a vocal cord examination that Dr. Park had insisted on after noticing a persistent rasp in his lower register during recordings. The results had not been good. Not catastrophic, not career-ending, but not good. Vocal nodules, still small, still manageable with rest and therapy, but present and growing and directly linked to the way Jungkook had been using his voice, pushing through fatigue, belting in ranges he shouldn't have been sustaining, and refusing to transpose songs downward because the original key was what the fans expected. Dr. Park had recommended 6 weeks of vocal rest. The tour was scheduled to begin in 8. Jungkook had told no one about the diagnosis. He had sat in Dr. Park's office, nodded at her recommendations, thanked her politely, and walked out into the corridor and immediately begun calculating how to hide it. He would do the vocal exercises in private. He would adjust his technique subtly enough that the vocal coaches wouldn't notice, and he would rest his voice between rehearsals, claiming he was saving it, a common enough practice that wouldn't raise suspicion. And he would work twice as hard on the choreography to compensate, because if his voice was going to betray him, his body would have to carry the difference. That was when the sleep started going. An hour shaved here, 30 minutes there. Extra sessions in the practice room after the others had left, running the choreography alone with his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors, pushing the counts faster, adding flourishes, driving himself toward a version of the performance that would be so physically astonishing that no one would notice the careful way he was managing his voice. He started drinking more coffee, then energy drinks, then the kind of caffeine supplements that came in small bottles with warning labels he didn't read. Jimin had noticed first. That was the thing about Park Jimin. The thing that made his guilt now so devastating, so radioactive in its implications. Jimin noticed everything about Jungkook. Not in the obsessive surveillance way of a manager or a worried parent, but in the organic, unconscious way of someone whose emotional wiring had been entangled with another person's for so long that the two systems had effectively merged. Jimin could feel Jungkook's mood the way most people feel changes in air pressure, not through direct observation, but through some deeper, more atmospheric sense. A shift in Jungkook's energy would register in Jimin's body before it registered in his mind. A vague unease that preceded any specific thought, like the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground moves. 3 weeks into Jungkook's secret, Jimin had found him in practice room 4 at 2 in the morning. The building was supposed to be locked, but Jungkook had a key. Or rather, Jungkook had the security code, because Jungkook had always had the security code, because the building's security team had long ago tried to enforce operating hours on a person whose relationship with practice bordered on the devotional. Jimin had been unable to sleep himself, a chronic issue that he managed with medication and meditation, and the occasional 3 a.m. walk through the city. And some pole he couldn't name, had brought him to the building instead of the Han River, to the 4th floor instead of the lobby, to the door of practice from 4 where the light was on, and the sound of sneakers on hardwood was leaking through the gap beneath the door. He had opened the door and found Jungkook mid-routine, drenched in sweat, his tank top soaked through so completely that it clung to his torso like a second skin. The practice room smelled of exertion and the faintly chemical scent of the energy drink cans lined up along the mirror wall, 5 of them, all empty. Jungkook's hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were glassy with fatigue, and his movements, while still technically precise, had the quality of something automated, mechanical, the body executing commands the mind had issued hours ago and never updated. Jungkook. Jimin leaned against the doorframe, and his voice had been carefully light, carefully casual, because he understood that the worst thing you could do to Jungkook in a moment like this is make him feel observed. It's 2:15. Jungkook hadn't stopped moving. His reflection in the mirror made eye contact with Jimin's, which was somehow worse than direct eye contact. The conversation happening between two reflected versions of themselves, ghosts in glass. "I know what time it is, Hung." "Okay." Jimin paused, chose his next words with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments. "You look like you're about to pass out." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Jungkook, stop for a second. Just stop." He had stopped, not because Jimin asked, but because his body chose that exact moment to revolt. A wave of dizziness that he tried to disguise as a deliberate pause, reaching for his water bottle with an overly casual motion that didn't fool Jimin for a fraction of a second. Jimin had spent too many years reading Jungkook's body language the way scholars read ancient texts, carefully, attentively, alive to the spaces between the visible marks. "How many nights this week?" Jimin asked. "How many nights what?" "How many nights have you been here past midnight?" Jungkook drank his water instead of answering, and the non-answer was its own answer, and they both knew it. What happened next was the part that Jimin would replay in his mind 1,000 times in the weeks to come, the part that he would calcify into guilt, the moments he would identify as his failure point, because what happened next was Jimin let it go. Not entirely, not carelessly. He sat down on the practice room floor and talked to Jungkook for 40 minutes about nothing important, about a drama Sejeon had recommended, about a new restaurant in Gangnam, about the ridiculous hat Hoso wore to their schedule that morning. He made Jungkook sit down, made him eat the protein bar he'd brought in his jacket, because Jimin always carried protein bars now, had started carrying them weeks ago for exactly this reason, a quiet accommodation to a problem he was choosing to manage rather than confront. He walked Jungkook back to the dorms. He watched him go into his room. But he didn't ask why. He didn't push past the surface into the territory beneath, the place where the vocal diagnosis lived, where the fear lived, where the toxic equation of worth equals output was grinding Jungkook's body down to its foundations. He didn't push because he knew with the intimate certainty of long love that pushing Jungkook before Jungkook was ready would trigger a retreat so total, so fortified, that no amount of subsequent gentleness would breach the walls. Jimin had learned this lesson years ago, in smaller moments, in lower stakes situations, and he had generalized it into a principle. You wait for Jungkook, you create space, you make yourself available, and eventually, in his own time, at his own pace, Jungkook comes to you. Except this time, Jungkook didn't come. And the weeks passed, and the tour rehearsals intensified, and Jimin watched from the careful distance he'd chosen, carrying protein bars and making late-night conversation, and never once saying the words that might have cracked the situation open. I'm scared for you. I think something is really wrong. Please tell me what it is. He didn't say those words because he was afraid that saying them would change the shape of what he and Jungkook were to each other, would introduce a dynamic of caretaker and patient that Jungkook would reject and resent. He didn't say those words because he believed, with the desperate optimism of someone who loves another person and cannot bear to see the full scope of their suffering, that Jungkook would find his own way back from whatever edge he was walking. He didn't say those words because saying them would have required admitting to himself that the situation was beyond what protein bars and midnight conversations could fix. And that admission would have been terrifying, and Jimin was already carrying so much fear that adding more felt structurally impossible. So he watched. And Jungkook deteriorated, and now Jungkook was on the floor of the Seoul Olympic Gymnasium with a medical team fitting a cervical collar around his neck as a precaution, and Jimin was standing 3 steps away with guilt etched into every line of his face, and Taehyung was crying because he could see all of it, the whole terrible architecture of love and silence and good intentions that had led them here. They loaded Jungkook onto the stretcher. His eyes were open now, but they were unfocused, drifting, the way eyes look when consciousness is present but comprehension hasn't fully arrived. He was mumbling something, and Namjoon leaned close to hear, and whatever Jungkook said made Namjoon close his eyes for a moment and press his lips together hard enough to drain their color from them. Later, Taehyung would learn that what Jungkook had mumbled was, "Don't cancel the show. I just need 5 minutes." They took him to the hospital, not the company's private clinic, not the discreet medical suite on the 4th floor of the HYB building where idols went to be treated away from cameras and public concern. An actual hospital, because Dr. Park's preliminary assessment suggested dehydration severe enough to warrant IV fluids and monitoring, combined with what she delicately called extreme physical exhaustion, and what she privately, in the hallway outside the gymnasium where she thought no one could hear, called a body shutting itself down because it's been running on caffeine and willpower for God knows how long. Yoongi heard her. He had followed at a distance, silent as a shadow, and he was standing around the corner when Dr. Park made the call to the hospital, and her words, caffeine and willpower, embedded themselves in his mind like splinters. The ride to the hospital was a study in different kinds of silence. Seokjin drove the van because Seokjin always drove in emergencies. It was an unspoken role he had assumed years ago, the practical one, the one who could compartmentalize his fear efficiently enough to operate heavy machinery while his brothers fell apart in the seats behind him. Namjoon sat in the front passenger seat with his phone in his hand, composing and deleting messages to their manager, trying to find language that would convey the severity of the situation, without triggering the kind of corporate panic that will turn Jungkook's collapse into a PR event before it had finished being a human one. Jimin and Taehyung were not in the van. They had stayed behind at the gymnasium, not by choice, but by the accidental choreography of crisis. By the time they'd gathered themselves enough to move, the van had already pulled away with the stretcher inside, and the second vehicle was being brought around. They stood together on the loading dock behind the venue, in the gray November light, surrounded by equipment cases and coiled cables, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke.
Then Taehyung said, "You knew." It wasn't a question. Taehyung didn't frame it as a question because he wasn't interested in giving Jimin the option of denial. He said it flat, said it as fact, said it with the terrible gentleness of someone who is too heartbroken to be angry. Jimin didn't deny it. He also didn't explain, didn't defend, didn't launch into the justifications that had been cycling through his mind for weeks. The careful, reasonable-sounding arguments about respecting Jungkook's autonomy, about not wanting to betray his trust, about believing that patience was a form of love rather than a form of negligence. Those arguments, which had seemed so solid in the privacy of his own head, had dissolved the moment Jungkook's knees hit the stage. They were gone. All that was left was the guilt, and the guilt was honest in the way that justifications never are. "I knew he wasn't sleeping," Jimin said. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, from the bottom of a well, from the other side of a wall he'd built around himself and was now trapped behind. "I knew he was pushing too hard. I didn't know it was this bad. Or maybe I did. Maybe I did know, and I told myself I didn't because knowing would have meant I had to do something, and I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what to do." His voice broke on the last repetition, and Park Jimin, who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of emotional control, of channeling feeling into performance, and keeping the raw, unprocessed stuff locked away where audiences and cameras and even his closest friends couldn't reach it. Park Jimin put his hands over his face and began to cry. It was not the kind of crying that people do on camera. It was not beautiful. It was not composed. It was the ugly, uncontrolled crying of genuine despair, the kind that involves the whole body, that turns you into a curled, shaking thing, that makes sounds you didn't know you could make. Jimin's shoulders heaved, and his breath came in gasps that sounded like they were being torn out of him, and he slid down the concrete wall of the loading dock until he was sitting on the ground with his knees drawn up, and his face hidden, and his entire body convulsing with the force of what he was releasing. Taehyung sat down next to him, not across from him, not standing above him, but beside him, shoulder to shoulder, the way they had sat in 100 practice rooms and 1,000 hotel rooms and 10,000 moments of ordinary closeness over the years. He didn't say it's okay because it wasn't okay. He didn't say it's not your fault, because the question of fault was too complex and too raw to simplify in that moment. He just sat there, and he let his own tears fall, and he pressed his shoulder against Jimin's shoulder, and the two of them cried together on the loading dock of the Seoul Olympic Gymnasium, while the November wind carried the sound of the city around them. After a while, 5 minutes or 15, time had become unreliable. Jimin's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths and then into something approaching stillness. He lowered his hands from his face. His eyes were swollen and red and his cheeks were wet, and he looked, Taehyung thought, like someone who had been through a natural disaster, scoured, stripped, reduced to essentials. "I kept bringing him protein bars," Jimin said, and the absurdity of it, the tragic inadequacy of the gesture, made him almost laugh, a sound that came out halfway between a chuckle and a sob. "Protein bars, like that was going to fix it, like I could feed him back to health, one granola bar at a time while he destroyed himself in front of me." "Why didn't you tell us?" Taehyung asked, and the us carried weight. It meant Namjoon, who would have known what to do, who would have intervened with the diplomatic firmness that was his particular gift. It meant Seokjin, who would have gone to the company, who would have fought for rest days and schedule modifications with the righteous indignation of the eldest brother. It meant Hosok, who would have known how to make Jungkook laugh, and then, in the softened space that laughter creates, how to ask the hard questions. It meant Yoongi, who would have simply sat with Jungkook in silence until the silence became permission, and the permission became confession. "Because he trusted me," Jimin said, and the simplicity of the answer was devastating. "He didn't tell me directly, but he let me see. He let me be in the practice room at 2 a.m. He let me walk him home. He let me bring the protein bars. And I thought that if I told you, if I turned it into a group thing, he'd feel betrayed. He'd close up. He'd stop letting anyone see." Taehyung understood this. He hated it, hated the logic of it, hated the way it made a kind of terrible sense, but he understood it. Because he knew Jungkook too, knew the fortress mentality, knew the way Jungkook could disappear behind walls so thick and so seamlessly constructed that you wouldn't even realize he'd withdrawn until you reached for him and your hand met stone. "But he collapsed, Jimin," Taehyung said softly. "He's in a hospital." "I know," Jimin's voice was barely audible. "I know." The second van arrived. A staff member whose name Taehyung couldn't remember in the chaos opened the door and said something about the hospital, about which entrance to use, about avoiding the press. Taehyung stood up and offered his hand to Jimin, and Jimin took it, and the contact palm against palm, fingers interlocking with the automatic ease of long practice, steadied something in both of them. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But something. They drove to the hospital in silence. Taehyung looked out the window and tried to organize his thoughts, but his thoughts refused organization. They kept returning to the image of Jimin's face in the moment after Jungkook fell, that expression of old, settled, furnished guilt. And each time the image surfaced, it brought with it a wave of emotion so complex that he couldn't parse its individual components. There was grief in it, and fear, and love, and a strange, aching admiration for the impossible position Jimin had been in, and anger at the industry that had created the conditions for all of this, and a deep, bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and everything to do with the cumulative weight of caring about people whose lives were not entirely their own. At the hospital, they were directed to a private wing, the company's connections ensuring discretion, ensuring that Jungkook's collapse would not become a headline before it became a story they could control. The hallway was quiet and smelled of antiseptic and artificial flowers, and Taehyung found the combination oppressive, a sensory contradiction that made his skin crawl. Namjoon was waiting outside Jungkook's room. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. His snapback was gone, lost somewhere between the gymnasium and the hospital, and without it, his forehead was bare and lined with worry in a way that Taehyung had never noticed before. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his head tilted back, staring at the ceiling, and when he saw Jimin and Taehyung approaching, he straightened up and his expression shifted into something that was trying very hard to be reassuring. "He's stable," Namjoon said. "Severe dehydration, exhaustion. They're giving him fluids and running some tests. Dr. Park is in there with the attending physician." He paused. "He keeps asking about the rehearsal schedule." Of course he does, Taehyung thought. Of course the first thing Jungkook does upon regaining consciousness in a hospital bed is worry about the rehearsal he's missing. Of course his body's catastrophic failure hasn't changed the calculus in his head, hasn't disrupted the equation that says his value is measured in his output, and his output has just dropped to 0, and therefore he is currently worth nothing. Of course. "Can we see him?" Jimin asked. Namjoon studied Jimin's face for a moment, a long, searching look that suggested Namjoon was seeing something there, reading something in the swollen eyes and the tear-tracked cheeks and the particular quality of Jimin's stillness that went beyond normal worry. But Namjoon didn't ask. Not yet. He just nodded and stepped aside. The room was small and white and filled with the soft beeping of monitors. Jungkook was propped up in the bed with an IV line running into the back of his left hand, and he looked diminished. That was the word that came to Taehyung's mind. Diminished. Not just physically, though the physical diminishment was stark enough. The hollows under his cheekbones more pronounced than they should have been, his collarbones visible above the neckline of the hospital gown, his wrists looking thin and somehow fragile in a way that didn't match the mental image Taehyung carried of Jungkook's wrists, which were strong and sure, and wrapped in the leather bracelets he never took off. Even those were gone now, removed by the medical staff, and their absence made Jungkook's wrists look naked and vulnerable, like trees stripped of bark. Seokjin was sitting in the chair beside the bed, and Hoseok was perched on the windowsill, and Yoongi was standing in the corner with his back against the wall, and all three of them looked up when Jimin and Taehyung entered, and the room's emotional temperature shifted perceptibly, became more charged, more complex, more layered with the things that were not being said. Jungkook's eyes found Jimin immediately. Not Taehyung, not Namjoon who had entered behind them, but Jimin. And in that instant, in the flicker of recognition and something else, something that looked like apology or confession or both, Taehyung understood that the connection between Jimin and Jungkook in this crisis was a closed circuit, a private frequency, a conversation that had been happening in the silences between words for weeks and was only now, in this sterile white room, becoming visible to the rest of them. Taehyung, Jungkook said, and his voice was a rasp, a shadow of itself, and the sound of it, the damaged, diminished sound of Jimin Jungkook's voice, which was normally so strong and so effortlessly beautiful, made Hoseok turn his face toward the window. Jimin walked to the bedside. He looked down at Jungkook, and Jungkook looked up at him, and the exchange that passed between them was wordless and immense and private, and Taehyung felt like an intruder for witnessing it but could not look away. Then Jimin sat down on the edge of the bed, very carefully, as if the bed might break, and he took Jungkook's hand, the one without the IV, and he held it in both of his own. And he didn't say anything. He just held Jungkook's hand and looked at him with those red, swollen, still wet eyes, and Jungkook's face did something complicated. A sequence of micro-expressions that moved through confusion and recognition and realization, and finally arrived at a destination that made Jungkook's lower lip tremble and his eyes fill. "I'm sorry," Jungkook whispered. "Don't," Jimin said, "don't apologize. I didn't want you to. I know what you didn't want." And Taehyung, standing by the door, felt the tears start again, not the hot, shocked tears of the loading dock, but something quieter, something that came from a deeper place, a well of feeling that had been there long before today and would be there long after. He cried because the scene before him was both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because the love in it was so evident, so undeniable, so structurally integral to who these two people were. Terrible because that love had not been enough to prevent this, had, in fact, been part of what allowed it, the love becoming a cage made of gentleness and patience, and the fear of breaking something precious. Seokjin stood up quietly and gestured for the others to follow him into the hallway. One by one they filed out, Hoseok with his hand on Yoongi's shoulder, Namjoon with his phone back in his hand, Taehyung last, pausing at the door for one final look at Jimin and Jungkook, who were now leaning toward each other, foreheads almost touching, a private geometry of grief and relief, and the beginning of something that might, with time and honesty and the willingness to be afraid together, become healing. In the hallway, Seokjin said, "We need to talk about the tour." No one responded immediately. The word tour felt obscene in the context, a profanity spoken in a church. But Seokjin was right. He was always right about the practical things, the logistical things, the things that existed outside of emotion and required attention regardless of how anyone was feeling, and they all knew it. "Not tonight," Namjoon said. "Tomorrow, let him rest tonight." Yoongi spoke for the first time since the gymnasium. His voice was low and hoarse, as if he'd been the one with the damaged vocal cords, and what he said was not about the tour. "How long has this been going on?" The question hung in the hallway, and everyone knew who it was really directed at, and everyone looked at the closed door of Jungkook's room, behind which Jimin was still sitting on the edge of the bed, still holding Jungkook's hand, still caught in the terrible space between the love that had made him stay silent and the silence that had allowed this to happen. "We'll find out," Namjoon said. "We'll find out everything, but not tonight." Taehyung leaned against the hospital wall and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the image persisted, Jimin's face in the moment after the collapse, the guilt like a landscape, like something geological, something that had been forming long before anyone thought to look for it. And he wondered. Standing in that antiseptic hallway with his brothers around him, and the muffled sound of the hospital at night pressing in from every direction, whether love was always like this, whether it always contained within itself the seeds of its own cruelty, the tender intention that curdles into the wound it was trying to prevent. He didn't have an answer. He suspected there wasn't one, or at least not one that could be spoken in a hospital hallway at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. But the question itself felt important, felt like something worth carrying, and so he carried it, along with the image of Jimin's face and the sound of Jungkook's knees on the stage floor, and the weight of everything that was coming, everything that they would have to face in the days and weeks ahead, out of the hospital and into the cold November night, where the city continued around them, indifferent and luminous. A million lights burning for a million reasons that had nothing to do with 7 men and the fragile, extraordinary, imperfect thing they had built together. The night was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for now, in this particular moment, the questions could wait, and the fears could wait, and even the guilt could wait. What could not wait? What was happening right now, behind a closed door in a quiet room on the 4th floor of a Seoul hospital, was the simple, irreducible act of one person holding another person's hand and refusing to let go. And for tonight, that would have to be enough. Namjoon hadn't slept. He could tell by the quality of the light, that thin, provisional gray that Seoul produces in November, the kind that doesn't so much illuminate as merely replace darkness, that it was somewhere around 6:30 in the morning, and he could tell by the stiffness in his neck and the particular ache behind his left eye that he had spent the night in the vinyl-upholstered chair in the hospital's 4th-floor waiting area, drifting in and out of a state that was too shallow to be called sleep and too unconscious to be called rest. His phone showed 43 unread messages, 17 from their manager, Sejin, ranging in tone from concern to urgent to a final one at 4 a.m. that simply read, "Call me when you can. The company is asking questions I don't have answers to." 8 from the PR team, 6 from the tour production coordinator in Los Angeles, 12 from various group chats that he didn't open, and 1 from his mother, who somehow always knew when something was wrong, the way mothers do, sent at 5:15 a.m. "Are you eating? Call when you can. I love you." He stared at his mother's message for a long time, his thumb hovering over the reply field, and then locked his phone without responding because he didn't trust himself to type the words "I'm fine," without the lie of it infecting everything else he'd need to say today. And today was a day that would require precision, diplomacy, and a version of honesty that he hadn't yet figured out how to construct. The waiting area was empty except for Seokjin, who was asleep in the chair across from him. Actually asleep, not the performative dozing that Namjoon had been doing, but genuine unconsciousness, complete with the slightly open mouth and the soft, rhythmic breathing that Namjoon had heard 1,000 times through thin hotel walls on tour. Seokjin slept the way he did most things, completely, without reservation, as if he had made a deliberate decision to be asleep and was now executing that decision with full commitment. Even in a hospital chair, even in yesterday's clothes, even with the lines of worry still visible on his face, Kim Seokjin asleep looked like a person who had found a small, temporary peace and was holding onto it with both hands. Namjoon didn't wake him. Instead, he stood up, wincing at the protest of his lower back, and walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Seoul was waking up below him, the first buses moving through the streets, the neon signs of convenience stores glowing in the pre-dawn, a jogger crossing the bridge over the Chingyecheon stream with the mechanical determination of someone for whom running was not pleasure but penance. The city looked the same as it always did, which felt like an affront. The city should have looked different. Something should have shifted: the light, the angle of the buildings, the pattern of traffic. Something that acknowledged that the world Namjoon had gone to sleep in and the world he was waking up in were not the same world, even if they shared the same geography. Footsteps behind him. He turned and found Yoongi, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall, his face carrying the particular ashen pallor of a man who had also not slept, but who, unlike Namjoon, had not even attempted it. Yoongi extended one of the cups without speaking, and Namjoon took it, and the warmth of it against his palm was the first physical comfort he'd felt in 12 hours. "You look terrible," Yoongi said. "You look worse." "I know." Yoongi sipped his coffee, grimaced at the taste. Hospital vending machine coffee was an insult to the concept of coffee, and sipped again anyway. "I've been thinking. About all the things I should have noticed." Namjoon didn't respond immediately. He recognized the terrain Yoongi was entering, the post-crisis inventory, the brutal retrospective audit of every missed signal, Every overlooked moment, every conversation that could have gone differently if someone had asked one more question or listened a few seconds longer. It was the same territory Namjoon himself had been mapping all night, lying in that vinyl chair with his eyes closed and his mind open and unsparing. "We all should have noticed," Namjoon said. "No." Yoongi's voice had an edge to it, the kind of sharpness that in Yoongi was never aggression but always precision, a blade used for surgery, not combat. "We all have that excuse available to us, and it's comfortable and it's even partly true. But partly true is not the same as true. Some of us were closer. Some of us had more information. Some of us made choices." He wasn't looking at Namjoon. He was looking down the corridor, toward the closed door of Jungkook's room, and Namjoon understood that the "some of us" in Yoongi's statement had a specific referent, and that referent was Park Jimin. "Taehyung," Namjoon said carefully, "Jimin is. Jimin is suffering. I can see that. I'm not interested in blame, Namjoon. Blame is a luxury. What I'm interested in is understanding how we built a system where one of us can deteriorate for months and the rest of us don't intervene. That's not a Jimin problem. That's a structural problem. That's a us problem." This was why Namjoon relied on Yoongi, not for comfort, not for reassurance, but for the kind of ruthless clarity that cut through emotional noise and found the mechanism underneath. Yoongi's mind worked like a producer's ear. It could isolate the individual frequency in a wall of sound, find the one element that was off-key and trace it back to its source. Right now, Yoongi was tracing the source, and the source wasn't a person. The source was a pattern. The source was the way they had organized their love, generously, devotedly, but also passively, with too much respect for each other's privacy and not enough willingness to intrude on each other's pain. "I want to talk to Dr. Park this morning," Yoongi said. "The full picture, not the sanitized version she'll give the company. I'll arrange it. And I want us all in the room, all 7. No more fragmented information, no more people knowing different pieces. Whatever is happening with Jungkook, we face it together or we don't face it at all." Namjoon nodded. He finished his terrible coffee. The light outside the window was strengthening, the gray acquiring faint threads of gold as the sun found gaps in the November overcast, and the hospital was beginning its morning rhythms. The distant clatter of a food cart, the murmur of shift change, the opening and closing of doors that marked the transition from night's anxious quiet to the purposeful noise of day. By 8 o'clock, they were all there. Hoseok arrived first, at 7:15, carrying a bag from the bakery 3 blocks from the hospital. Pastries and sandwiches, and the kind of fruit juice that came in glass bottles and cost twice as much as it should. Because Young Hoseok's response to crisis was to feed people, to make sure the bodies around him were nourished even when the spirits inside them were starving. He set the bag on the waiting area table and began arranging its contents with a care that was almost ceremonial, placing napkins beside each sandwich, angling the juice bottles so their labels faced outward. The precision of it broke Namjoon's heart a little, this meticulous attention to surfaces while everything beneath them was in ruins. Taehyung arrived at 7:40, looking like he hadn't changed clothes because he hadn't. He was wearing the same black hoodie and gray sweatpants he'd been wearing at rehearsal, and there was a smudge of something stage dust, maybe, or the grime of the loading dock, on his left sleeve that he hadn't noticed or didn't care about. His eyes were puffy in the way that comes from crying, and then sleeping, and then crying again, the kind of puffiness that tells a story about the night that produced it. He sat down next to Hoseok and accepted a sandwich and held it in his lap without eating. Jimin arrived last at 7:55, and his arrival changed the air in the room the way a drop in barometric pressure changes the air before a storm. He was clean showered, changed into fresh clothes, his hair still slightly damp, and that cleanliness struck Namjoon as both admirable and heartbreaking, the effort Jimin had put into appearing composed when the composure was clearly a construction, a facade as thin as paper. His eyes, despite what must have been careful attention, were still visibly red. He sat in the chair nearest the door, as if he wanted to maintain the option of escape, and he folded his hands in his lap and looked at nothing. No one spoke to him about yesterday. Not yet. That conversation was coming, and everyone in the room knew it, and the knowledge of its approach filled the silence with a particular tension, not hostile, not accusatory, but weighted, the way air becomes weighted before it releases into rain. At 8:15, Dr. Park Sung-hee emerged from Jungkook's room, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression that Namjoon had learned to read during their years of working with her. Professional concern tempered by clinical distance, the face of a doctor who had something to say and had already decided how to say it but hadn't yet decided how much to reveal. "He slept through the night," she said, addressing the group. "The fluids have helped. His vitals are stable, blood pressure is normalizing. He's awake now and asking to see you, which I'll allow in a few minutes, but first I need to discuss his condition with all of you, because what happened yesterday was not a simple fainting episode." She paused, looked at her tablet, looked back at them. Her gaze passed over each face, Namjoon's careful attentiveness, Seokjin's squared shoulders, Hosok's hands wrapped around a juice bottle, Yoongi's unblinking stare, Taehyung's downcast eyes, Jimin's absolute stillness, and something in her expression softened, just slightly, an involuntary yielding to the humanity of what she was about to say to 6 people who clearly loved the 7th. "Jungkook has been dealing with vocal cord nodules for approximately 3 months, she said. "I diagnosed them during a routine examination and recommended 6 weeks of vocal rest, along with therapeutic intervention. He did not follow those recommendations. Instead, he appears to have compensated by increasing his physical training regimen to an extreme degree, while simultaneously reducing his sleep to, based on the blood work and his own admission this morning, an average of 2 to 3 hours per night over the past several weeks." The information landed differently in each of them. Namjoon absorbed it with a slow, deliberate inhale, filing it, contextualizing it, already building the framework of response. Seokjin's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering near his ear. Hosok set down his juice bottle very carefully, as if it had become fragile. Yoongi didn't move, but his eyes narrowed in the way they did when he was converting emotion into calculation. Taehyung made a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a word. And Jimin closed his eyes. He closed them and kept them closed, and his face, already pale, lost whatever remaining color it had been holding, and his hands, folded in his lap, tightened against each other until the knuckles went white. He had known about the overwork. He had known about the sleeplessness. But the vocal nodules, the specific medical diagnosis, the recommended rest he hadn't known Jungkook had been prescribed, the calculated decision to hide a deteriorating condition, not just from the group, but from the medical professional who had identified it. This was new information, and it recontextualized everything Jimin had observed and everything Jimin had failed to do, and the recontextualization was clearly agonizing. 3 months, Seokjin repeated, and the words came out flat, stripped of the warmth that usually characterized his voice. "He's been hiding this for 3 months. Nodules themselves are still manageable," Dr. Park continued. "With proper rest and therapy, they should resolve without surgical intervention. My greater concern at this point is the physical damage caused by the sleep deprivation and overexertion. His cortisol levels are significantly elevated. His muscle enzymes indicate rhabdomyolysis. That's the breakdown of muscle tissue, essentially his body consuming itself for fuel, because he wasn't providing adequate nutrition or recovery time. His immune markers are suppressed. His cardiac rhythm showed some irregularity last night, which has since stabilized, but which indicates a level of physical stress that is, frankly, dangerous." She said the word dangerous, without emphasis, without drama, as a clinical fact, and somehow that was worse than if she had shouted it. The word sat in the waiting area like a stone dropped into water, its ripples spreading outward through the 6 men who were listening. "How long until he can perform?" The question came from the doorway behind them, and everyone turned, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Park Ki-young, not a relative, despite the surname, was the head of artist management at HYBE, a tall woman in her early 40s with a reputation for efficiency that bordered on ruthlessness and a genuine, if sometimes invisible, concern for the artists in her care. She was standing in the corridor with a tablet of her own and an expression that was trying to balance corporate urgency with appropriate human concern, and not entirely succeeding. "That's not a question I can answer right now," Dr. Park said, and her voice acquired a professional frost that Namjoon recognized as the doctor's version of drawing a line. "He's been admitted for observation. I'll have a clearer picture in 48 hours. "The tour begins in 6 weeks, Ki-young said. "I need a timeline. And I need my patient to rest, which he won't do if he thinks the tour is being discussed in terms of his readiness." Dr. Park fixed Ki-young with a look that carried the authority of decades. 6 weeks is enough time for significant recovery, provided he actually rests. My recommendation, which I will be putting in writing, is a minimum of 2 weeks complete vocal rest and physical restriction, followed by a gradual reintroduction of training. I will also be recommending mandatory psychological evaluation, because the behavioral pattern that led to this collapse is not purely physical in nature. The phrase psychological evaluation moved through the group like an electric current. In the industry they inhabited, those words carried weight: stigma despite progress, implication despite normalization, the suggestion that something was wrong not just with the body but with the mind, and in a culture that still, despite its best efforts, treated mental health with more caution than openness, the phrase was charged. "I'll take that under advisement," Ki-young said, and Namjoon could hear in her voice the careful non-commitment of a corporate officer who would consult with legal and public relations before making any promises to a doctor. Yoongi stood up. The motion was unhurried. There was nothing aggressive about it, nothing overtly confrontational. He simply rose from his chair, turned to face Ki-young, and regarded her with an expression that Namjoon had seen exactly twice before in their years together. Once during a contract renegotiation that had nearly ended their career, and once during a private meeting with a journalist who had published false information about one of them. It was the expression of a man who had weighed the political cost of what he was about to say against the moral cost of silence, and found silence to be the more expensive option. "The tour can wait," Yoongi said. "Yoongi SSI, I understand your concern, but—" "The tour can wait," he repeated, and his voice didn't rise. It lowered, which was worse. Yoongi's anger had always operated inversely to volume. The quieter he became, the more dangerous the territory. "The dates can be moved. The venues can be rebooked. The fans will understand because our fans have always understood, because we have built something with them that is bigger than a schedule. What cannot be rebooked is Jungkook's health. What cannot be rescheduled is his vocal cords, his heart, his immune system, his mind. So with respect, Ki-young SSI, I am telling you, not asking, telling that this conversation about timelines will not happen in this hospital, and it will not happen today, and it will not happen until our brother is well enough to be part of it, because decisions about his body and his career will not be made in a hallway while he lies in a bed 20 feet away wondering if he's let everyone down." The silence that followed was total. Ki-young held Yoongi's gaze for 3 seconds, 4, 5, and then something in her expression shifted, not capitulation, exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a woman who had worked with these men long enough to know when a line had been drawn that could not be crossed without consequences that no corporate strategy could manage. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "Please keep me informed of any changes in his condition." She left. The sound of her heels on the linoleum receded down the corridor like a diminishing drumbeat, and when it was gone, the silence it left behind was different from the silence that had preceded it, warmer, more unified, a silence of solidarity rather than tension. Seokjin looked at Yoongi with an expression that contained multitudes, pride, gratitude, concern about the political ramifications, and underneath all of it, the simple, uncomplicated love of an older brother watching a younger one do something brave. That was either very wise or very foolish, he said. Those are usually the same thing, Yoongi replied, and sat back down, and picked up his terrible coffee, and drank it as if he hadn't just drawn a line in the sand against the corporate machinery that controlled significant aspects of their professional lives. Dr. Park, who had watched the exchange with the practiced neutrality of a medical professional who had learned long ago not to get involved in the politics of the entertainment industry, cleared her throat. "You can see him now. 2 at a time, please. He's tired and I don't want him overwhelmed." Namjoon looked at Jimin. It was a deliberate look, a leadership look, the kind of look that communicated both instruction and permission. "You first," he said. "You and Taehyung." Jimin opened his eyes. He looked at Namjoon, then at Taehyung, then at the closed door of Jungkook's room, and his face passed through a series of expressions that were like weather systems, fear and reluctance and determination, and a kind of raw, exposed vulnerability that made him look younger than his years, younger than his experience. As young as the boy from Busan, who had arrived at the company all those years ago with nothing but talent and terror, and a capacity for love that would eventually become both his greatest strength and his most dangerous liability. "Okay," Jimin said. He stood up. His legs were steady, which was either courage or performance, and with Jimin it was always difficult to tell the difference because he had spent so long perfecting the latter that it had become indistinguishable from the former. Taehyung rose to join him, and together they walked to Jungkook's door, and Taehyung reached for the handle but paused before turning it, because he could feel Jimin beside him, could feel the fine tremor running through Jimin's body like a current through a wire, and he understood that Jimin was about to walk into a room and face the consequences of his choices. The choice to watch and wait, the choice to bring protein bars instead of confrontation, the choice to love Jungkook in the way that felt safest rather than the way that was needed, and that this facing would be one of the hardest things Park Jimin had ever done. Taehyung put his hand on Jimin's back, a small gesture, his palm flat against Jimin's spine between the shoulder blades in the place where tension collects and breath catches. He didn't push. He just rested his hand there, a point of contact, a reminder that whatever was on the other side of this door, Jimin would not face it alone. Jimin exhaled, a long, controlled breath that shuddered slightly at the end. Then he nodded and Taehyung opened the door. Jungkook was sitting up. That was the first thing Taehyung noticed. He was upright in the hospital bed, propped against pillows, the IV still running into his hand, but his posture was deliberate, arranged. The posture of someone who had heard footsteps approaching and had marshaled his remaining energy into a presentation of wellness. His hair was pushed back from his forehead, revealing the full landscape of his face, and Taehyung was struck again by the hollowness of it. The shadows under the eyes deeper than makeup could have hidden, the cheekbones sharper than choreography could explain, the lips dry and pale in a way that spoke of weeks of neglect, not hours. But his eyes were clear. That was the second thing Taehyung noticed, and it was the thing that made his chest ache most acutely, because Jungkook's eyes, those dark, expressive, impossibly earnest eyes that had been the first thing Taehyung had noticed about a 14-year-old boy in a practice room more than a decade ago, were clear and alert and full of something that looked like readiness. Not readiness for recovery, readiness for judgment. He was sitting up in his hospital bed, after a collapse caused by months of self-destruction, and he was bracing himself not for sympathy but for disappointment, because Jeon Jungkook's internal calculus had always weighted other people's disappointment heavier than his own pain, had always placed his failures on one side of the scale and his worth on the other, and the balance had never once come out in his favor. "Hi," Jungkook said, and the simplicity of the greeting, the casualness of it, was a performance so transparent and so brave that Taehyung had to look away for a moment to collect himself. Jimin walked to the bed, He didn't sit down this time. He stood at the bedside, looking down at Jungkook, and the distance between standing and sitting was meaningful. It was the distance between comfort and confrontation, between the softness of last night's hand-holding and the hardness of what needed to happen now. "The vocal nodules," Jimin said, not a question, a statement, an opening. Jungkook's expression flickered surprise, then recognition, then a brief, involuntary closing, the drawbridge going up before he could stop it. "Dr. Park told you." "Dr. Park told all of us." Jimin's voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him. Taehyung could see it in the tension of his jaw, the way his fingers were pressed flat against his thighs, the micro-movements of control that were holding him together from the outside while the inside did whatever it was doing. 3 months, Jungkook. You've known for 3 months. It wasn't that serious. You're in a hospital bed. Because I pushed too hard on the choreography, not because of the nodules. The nodules are. The nodules are the reason you pushed too hard on the choreography. Jimin's voice cracked, and the crack was seismic, a fissure opening in the carefully maintained surface, allowing something hot and pressurized to escape. You were compensating. I can see it now. I could see it then, pieces of it, but I didn't have the whole picture, and you made sure I didn't have the whole picture, Jungkook. You let me close enough to see that you were struggling, but not close enough to see why. Do you understand what that did to me? Do you have any idea what these past weeks have been like, watching you and knowing something was wrong and not being able to reach it? Jungkook was looking at Jimin with an expression that Taehyung couldn't fully read from his position by the door. Something complex and layered, something that contained guilt and defiance and love, and the particular anguish of a person who had hurt someone they cherish through the very act of trying to protect them. "I didn't want you to worry," Jungkook said quietly. "I worried anyway. I worried every single day. I worried when I found you in the practice room at 2 a.m. and you told me you were fine. I worried when you started losing weight, and I started carrying food with me everywhere I went just in case I could get you to eat. I worried when your voice started sounding different in rehearsals, and you blamed it on allergies, and I wanted to believe you because the alternative was..." Jimin stopped, drew a breath. "The alternative was that you were hiding something real, and if you were hiding something real from me, then everything I thought I understood about us was wrong." The word "us" landed in the room with a weight disproportionate to its size. It was a small word, just 2 letters, but it contained the entire architecture of Jimin and Jungkook's relationship. The years of proximity, the shared language, the instinctive understanding that had allowed them to dance in sync and finish each other's sentences, and know, without checking, when the other was in the room. "Us" was the foundation, and Jungkook's secrecy had not destroyed it but had revealed a crack in it that neither of them had known was there, and the crack was this: that closeness and honesty are not the same thing, that you can know someone completely and still not know the one thing that matters most, that love can be both the bridge and the gap it spans. Taehyung stood by the door and felt the scene unfolding before him with the helpless absorption of someone watching a play, moved by it, devastated by it, unable to intervene because the drama belonged to the 2 people performing it. His role here was witness. He understood that now. Namjoon had sent him in with Jimin not as a participant, but as an anchor, someone whose presence would prevent the conversation from spiraling into places that neither Jimin nor Jungkook could return from alone. He was here to be the edge of the frame, the limit of the canvas, the gentle boundary that kept the painting from bleeding off the page. Jungkook's eyes were wet. He was fighting it, fighting the tears with the same stubborn, futile determination with which he'd fought the exhaustion and the vocal damage and the body's relentless insistence on its own limits. But he was losing, and the losing was visible, a slow collapse of a different kind, not of the body this time but of the defenses. "I was scared," Jungkook said, and the admission cost him something enormous. It was visible in the way his voice dropped, in the way his hands gripped the hospital blanket, in the way his eyes briefly closed as if he couldn't bear to watch the words leave his mouth. The tour, 42 cities, Taehyung. 42 cities and a new album and the documentary and everyone expecting me to be, and then the diagnosis, and all I could think was, if anyone finds out, they'll pull me from the tour. They'll replace me. They'll restructure the set list. And the fans will be disappointed and the members will have to work harder to cover for me, and I'll be the reason. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I'll be the reason it falls apart. The sentence hung in the air, and Taehyung felt it like a physical blow, not to his body, but to his understanding of Jungkook, which had always been deep but which he now realized had never fully reached this particular depth. This bedrock layer of fear where Jungkook genuinely believed that his absence would cause collapse, that his need for rest would inflict damage, that the simple human act of saying, "I am hurt and I need help," was equivalent to betrayal. Jimin sat down on the bed. He sat down heavily, as if his legs had simply refused to hold him any longer, and the mattress dipped under his weight, and he was close enough to Jungkook now that their shoulders were almost touching, and his face was doing something that Taehyung had to look away from because it was too raw, too exposed, too much like watching someone remove their own armor in the middle of a battlefield. "You could never be the reason it falls apart," Jimin said, and his voice was thick and broken and absolutely certain. "You are the reason it holds together. You have always been the reason it holds together. Not because of what you do, Jungkook, because of who you are. And who you are doesn't change when your voice needs rest. Who you are doesn't diminish when your body needs sleep. The tour, the songs, the performances, none of that is worth anything if you're not okay. None of it means anything without you. Don't you see that? Don't you understand that you are not a function? You are not a product of your output. You are a person, and we love the person, and the person is lying in a hospital bed because he forgot that he was allowed to be human." Jungkook's tears came then, not the fighting kind but the surrendering kind. The tears that arrive when the walls finally fall, and the thing you've been holding back is suddenly too large to contain. They rolled down his hollowed cheeks and collected at his jawline and dropped onto the hospital blanket, darkening the fabric in small circles, and Jimin put his arm around Jungkook's shoulders and pulled him close, and Jungkook's forehead came to rest against the side of Jimin's neck, and his body shook with sobs that were silent, except for the breath that accompanied them, ragged and gasping, and young-sounding in a way that made Taehyung think of trainee days. Of a boy who cried in practice rooms because he thought he wasn't good enough and who had, it turned out, never fully stopped believing that. Taehyung stepped out of the room. He closed the door behind him softly, giving them the privacy that the moment demanded, and stood in the corridor with his back against the wall and his eyes on the ceiling, and his heart doing something complicated that he didn't have a name for. The others were still in the waiting area, visible through the open doorway at the end of the hall, and he could see Namjoon talking quietly to Seokjin, and Hoseok arranging and rearranging the food he'd brought, and Yoongi sitting apart from all of them, staring at his phone without actually looking at it. After a while, Taehyung didn't know how long the door opened and Jimin emerged. His eyes were red again, freshly red, but his expression had changed. The guilt was still there, present and permanent, a resident that had moved in and would take time to evict. But alongside it there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before. Resolution, perhaps, or the beginning of it. The commitment that comes after the confession, the forward motion that becomes possible only once you've stopped running and turned to face the thing you've been running from. "He wants to see everyone," Jimin said, "together." Taehyung nodded. He went to the waiting area and delivered the message, and one by one they stood up and walked down the corridor, 7 men moving toward a small room where one of them was sitting up in a hospital bed with tears still drying on his face, and a truth he'd been carrying alone for 3 months now finally shared. They filled the room. Not at the bedside, Dr. Park had said 2 at a time, but Dr. Park was not here, and this was not a medical visit. This was something else. Seokjin leaned against the wall by the window, Namjoon stood at the foot of the bed. Hoseok perched on the radiator cover. Yoongi took the chair that Dr. Park had been using. Taehyung sat on the floor, cross-legged, his back against the bed frame. And Jimin returned to the edge of the mattress, close enough to Jungkook that their arms were touching. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was filled with the beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of the hospital, and the breathing of 7 people who had shared a life together for more than a decade and who were, in this moment, confronting the possibility that sharing a life is not the same as knowing the lives you share. It was Jungkook who broke the silence. He looked at each of them in turn, a slow, deliberate survey of the faces he knew better than his own, and then he said, in a voice that was hoarse and thin but steady, "I owe you the truth." And then he told them, all of it, the diagnosis, the fear, the decision to hide it, the late-night practice sessions, the caffeine, the calculations he'd made about his own dispensability, the algebra of sacrifice that had seemed so logical in the privacy of his own mind, and that sounded, spoken aloud in a hospital room to the 6 people who loved him most in the world, insane and heartbreaking and desperately, painfully young. He told them about the morning he'd gotten the diagnosis, how he'd sat in his car in the parking garage beneath the HYBE building for 40 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, running scenarios. He told them about the night he'd realized the vocal exercises weren't working, how he'd stood in his bathroom and sung a single note, a G4, the note that anchored the chorus of their new title track, and heard the rasp in it, the failure in it, and felt something inside himself crack along a fault line he hadn't known existed. He told them about the weight he'd been losing, the appetite he'd been unable to maintain, the way food had started to taste like nothing, like obligation, like another task on a list that was already impossibly long. He told them, and they listened, and the listening was its own form of love, imperfect, insufficient, arrived too late to prevent what had already happened, but present now, fully present. Every one of them turned toward him with the complete attention that is the most generous thing one person can offer another. When he finished, the silence returned, but it was a different silence, not empty but full, saturated with understanding, with the kind of knowledge that changes the shape of a relationship not by adding something new, but by revealing what was always there, hidden beneath the surface of easy closeness and shared laughter, and the comfortable assumption that proximity equals intimacy. Seokjin spoke first. "You're going to rest," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was a statement of fact. Delivered with the quiet authority of the eldest, the one whose role it was to set boundaries when no one else would. "You're going to rest, and you're going to let Dr. Park treat your voice, and you're going to eat, and you're going to sleep. And if the tour has to wait, the tour waits. And if the album has to be adjusted, the album is adjusted. And none of it is a failure on your part. Do you hear me?" Jungkook nodded. It was a small nod, tentative, the nod of someone who has heard the words but hasn't yet absorbed them, who will need to hear them many more times in many different ways, before they begin to replace the older, crueler words that have been running on repeat in his head for months, for years, for as long as he can remember. Hoseok moved from the radiator to the bedside and placed the bag of pastries on Jungkook's lap. "Start with this," he said, and smiled, and the smile was not forced, not performed, but real in the way that only Hoseok's smiles could be real, full of warmth and light, and the stubborn belief that small acts of kindness were not trivial but essential, not the ornament of love but its architecture. Jungkook looked at the bag, and then at Hoseok, and something in his expression shifted, a loosening, a softening, the first visible sign that the walls he'd built were not impervious, that the love in this room was finding its way through the cracks and beginning the slow, necessary work of filling the spaces his fear had hollowed out. He reached into the bag and took out a pastry. He bit into it. He chewed and swallowed and took another bite, and the simple act of eating, of accepting nourishment from someone who had brought it for him, of allowing his body to receive what it needed, was not dramatic, was not cinematic, was not the kind of moment that would make a headline or trend on social media. But it was the beginning of something. Yoongi watched from the chair in the corner, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Later, when the others had filed out and Jungkook was drifting toward a medicated sleep, Yoongi would remain in that chair, a silent sentinel, refusing to leave. A nurse would come in and suggest he return to the waiting area. He would look at the nurse with an expression that made further suggestion unnecessary. He would stay through the afternoon and into the evening, not speaking, not sleeping, just present, a fixed point of gravity in the room, an anchor, a promise made in silence that required no words because its meaning was absolute. I am here. I am not leaving. You will not do this alone again. And in the corridor outside, in the fluorescent-lit, antiseptic-scented hallway where the rest of them gathered and dispersed and gathered again like a tide, Taehyung found Jimin standing by the window, looking out at the same Seoul skyline that Namjoon had watched at dawn. The light had changed. It was mid-morning now, the gray giving way to a cold, clear brightness that made the city look sharp and new, every edge defined, every shadow precise. "He's going to be okay," Taehyung said, and he meant it. But he also meant something larger than the immediate medical prognosis. He meant the other okay, the deep okay, the structural okay, the okay that would require not just rest and treatment and vocal therapy, but a fundamental renegotiation of the terms on which Jungkook lived his life and understood his value. Jimin turned from the window. His eyes met Taehyung's, and the expression in them was complicated and honest and unfinished, like a painting still in progress, like a sentence still being written. "Will we be okay?" Jimin asked, and the question wasn't about the tour or the album or the company's reaction or the headlines that would inevitably come. The question was about them, the seven of them, the constellation they had formed, the intricate web of love and loyalty and unspoken expectation that held them together, and that had, it was now clear, also allowed one of them to fall through its gaps. Taehyung thought about it. He owed Jimin an honest answer, because honest answers were what had been missing, what had been sacrificed in the name of comfort and patience, and the seductive lie that love alone was sufficient protection against the world's cruelties and a person's own. "I don't know," Taehyung said, "but I think we can be, if we stop being so careful with each other." Jimin considered this. A small, complicated smile, not happy, not sad, but something in between, something that acknowledged the cost of what they'd learned and the possibility of what they might build from it, crossed his face, and then settled there, becoming part of his expression the way new knowledge becomes part of understanding. Not erasing what came before, but adding to it, complicating it, making it more true. "Okay," Jimin said, "let's stop being careful." The hospital hummed around them, full of its small, constant sounds, monitors and footsteps and the rustle of curtains, and the murmur of voices carrying news both terrible and ordinary. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent, luminous life. And inside a room at the end of the corridor, Jungkook slept, and Yoongi sat beside him, and the silence between them was not empty but full, full of everything that had been said and everything that had not, full of the past and the present and the uncertain, necessary, frightening, possible future that was waiting for all of them on the other side of this day.